any groups you work with. And CPDUs will be available by contacting Ashley, and that information will be at the end of the presentation. So we'll start off now with Pat.
All right, so one of the 5 things we said we want to know about is to first know who your dual language learners are. It is always surprising to me when I ask that question when I go into a room that people don't know the answer to that. And it's very hard to be adequately prepared to meet kids' needs if you don't even know that they are dual language learners. So I just want to give you a sort of a 10,000-foot view of Illinois in terms of our percentage of English learners across school districts from 2005 to 2015. Judging from your knowledge level, I would suspect many of you are in the darker areas of the state. You can see where in 2005, the predominance of young dual language learners or English learners in the K-12 parlance are up around Chicago and Collier counties, and you can see little by little how English learners have spread to 2015 across the state. So there are very few school districts and certainly very few counties in Illinois that don't have English learners in their school district at this moment. This comes from the Migration Policy Institute that did a paper, a fact sheet, and highlighted Illinois because we are just so cool with dealing with our dual language learners. But I think it's really important to think about this. The total young child population in Illinois is 495,000 kids. That's huge. That's a huge number. And if you're thinking about looking at on the left, you see the number that from 0 to 2, 3 to 4, and 5 to 8, which is our early childhood group. We are really the 5th to 8th grade or 5 to 8-year-olds are larger, but they're also school-age kids. So we have a lot of children that are in the birth through 5 before they hit preschool or elementary school level. Of course, no surprise that we are overwhelmingly, our language minority population is Hispanic, but we also have a number of Asian, Black kids. And the number of parents who, if you look under parent English proficiency, that looks at English language attainment, that 41% of our parents are LEP, which is the old term for limited English proficiency that's used by the feds. Our top 5 home languages in Illinois are Spanish, Polish, Arabic, Chinese, and Tagalog. And again, our percentage of enrollment of kids 3 and 4 years old that are enrolled in our pre-K program is 45%. So it's in pre-K in particular, we know that we must be prepared and to serve children in this context. But knowing that these kids are coming from birth to 3 and going from K to 3, that we have the birth through 3rd grade population is overwhelmingly represented in the young ages in Illinois. Another interesting statistic is 65% of all pre-K-12 English learners are concentrated in the pre-K to 3rd grade realm. So you guys probably already know that since you're on this webinar, but just in case you need some ammunition to go back and talk to your community collaboratives, to talk to your other partners, to talk with agencies that feed into you or you transition to, this is important information and facts to have at the ready. So let's talk about a little bit about getting to know your families. So young dual language learners are a highly diverse group. And let me just clarify what I'm talking about at dual language learners. Any child birth through 5 who are learning 2 languages. In the K through 12 context, dual language learning means something different. It refers generally to a program model. In early childhood world, dual language learners refer to the children themselves. And this, when we're talking about the birth to 3rd grade continuity, this is one of the things that gets people nervous and also gets people confused, because they think we're talking about a dual language program as opposed to a dual language learner. But in preschool, birth through up to kindergarten, dual language learner really refers to the children, not the program type. Dual language, K through 12, typically refers to the program. Okay, so so we have that clarified. So let's just talk a little bit about the diversity in our groups. We know that our dual language learners are coming to us with a diverse set of skills in terms of their language. There may be communities, you may be in communities where there's a lot of speakers of a particular language, and in other communities there may be not very many speakers that share that language. There could be speakers of a language that have been in the US for a while, so the language skills of that group might be more typical of dual language or 2 bilingual folks where both languages are used at home. Or if they're more recent immigrants, it could be that just one language is used at home. So we have to assume, we have to understand that just because you are a bilingual child or a dual language child, you can't necessarily make assumptions about languages or languages spoken in the home, in terms of how sophisticated the languages are, or even to some extent what the languages are. So finding out what the languages are is quite a huge endeavor. I was working with a group that had children from the Philippines, and of course there are many, many different languages, even though Tagalog is one of the major ones, but the family didn't know that one of the parents spoke Ilocano and somebody else spoke Tagalog, and then there was a grandma that spoke a 3rd language. And so understanding what the complexities and the interactions of the languages are is huge. The second thing we have to think about is culture. And we understand that just because children come from the same country or even speak the same language, that doesn't mean they have the same cultural traditions and experiences. When I was teaching many, many moons ago in Elgin, we had a large Laotian population. And we also had a Lao Hmong population. Those are 2 different languages. They come from the same country, and their cultures are pretty distinct and pretty different. And the interactions between those 2 countries and those 2 cultures, can be, you need to be aware of some of the intricacies of that. Likewise, when I was a teacher, I had the Arabic speaker in my classroom, and I had kids from Iran and Iraq in the same room. You can only imagine some of the learning opportunities I had under those circumstances. The developmental pathways have everything to do with children's experiences with language and their experiences with grown-ups that speak that language. So what kind of exposure have children had to their home language and English? What kinds of experiences have children had? Some children live in places where they can't really go outside and play very much, so that their experiences are very constrained by who lives in their apartment or who lives in their direct maybe neighborhood. It also talks about, we also have to think about the intensity of the exposure to those languages. So thinking about type and intensity. The community experiences, we need to think of what who else lives in the community? What are the churches? What are the stores? What are the businesses? In some communities, children's culture and family culture are represented very well in the communities, and in some places, they are the only speaker of Uzbek, for example. The family values and beliefs about home language have a very predictable trajectory having to do with acculturation and where families are on the acculturation trajectory. If they're first generation, second generation, or third generation, we know second generation families or first generation families very often want their children to learn English quickly, because they think that has everything to do with success in the US, which it certainly does, but they don't realize losing home language has a great impact on their ability to parent, which also has a huge impact on children's eventual success. Family values and beliefs also are reflected in status, such as individuals who are refugee status or DACA families at this point, families that have different immigration statuses, impact children's and families' values about bilingualism and biculturalism, and we need to be aware of that. And of course, the individual child characteristics always is critical to understanding what children, what their abilities are and their strengths. And just a plug here that children with disabilities who have IEPs certainly add to the diversity, but in no way detract from the fact that they can be bilingual and bicultural. And in fact, many, many families are, or many, many individual children are. I'm not sure about how many of you have seen the, let's see if it works, seen the Eccles, the Head Start. Okay, seems like it doesn't want to work right now. There is a website on the bibliography that will lead you to the Head Start language and culture section of Head Start, which is an amazing resource if you've ever been there. And it gives you sort of some sample questions that can help you gather background information about families. And it helps you think about what is the language background of everybody in the family, and trying to figure out the issues related to literacy and literacy orientation around families, because we know that all families do not come to us with the same literacy orientation as the U.S. school system, and that doesn't mean that they aren't interested in the best for their children. It just means that when we send a book home and say, read this to your children, doesn't mean to your child, doesn't mean they know how to do that, because in their country or in their culture, they haven't had that orientation in terms of using their language for that purpose. Dual language development addresses the question of simultaneous or sequential literacy or dual language development. And simultaneous bilingualism refers to children who are learning more than one language from birth. So they're starting and hearing language either from parents in two languages, or sometimes for parents speak one language, or grandma and grandpa speak one language and the siblings speak a second language. And we know that we have more and more children who have these characteristics than we had 10 years ago. when most of the children were coming, were sequential. And sequential bilinguals are children who have learned their first language to a certain point, and then they're adding on a second language. And so where this partially established question is depends on which researcher you pay attention to, but typically in early childhood, we're talking about around age 2 or 3. So we will hear people say that simultaneous children don't have a strong language background because they don't speak either language very well. And that really has to do with more about our perceptions than the reality, because when we're looking at simultaneous children, we need to be looking at both both languages and sort of adding them together to see where they are in terms of their language development, to see how they are progressing. Whereas sequential bilinguals, you can look at home language as a better indicator of where children's language development is. And this is really important in the birth to 3 world, because we certainly had many miscommunications with families around whether they're simultaneous or sequential, and people making judgments about simultaneous children whose language isn't on par with their monolingual friends at their age. And people telling parents to stop speaking that language because their home language, because it isn't their child isn't very well developed and just speak English, and that is a recipe for disaster. I think that's definitely been minimized these days, but it certainly, I still hear stories of that happening, particularly around children birth to 3 who have some kind of a disability. Sequential is a more common approach, and a lot of our procedures are designed around sequential bilinguals, even though we have more simultaneous. So understanding that is a huge, huge piece of understanding who are your dual language learners. The third part that I want to address has to do with language preference. And we know, I'm sure you've seen kids and families who prefer to speak one language over the other, even though they have some skills in both languages. It happens to me. I am a non-native speaker. I have blue eyes and at some point had blonde hair, and when children look at me, they do not think that I am Hispanic, and they look at me and do not think I speak Spanish until I hang out and play with them for a little while, and then they shoot me looks and go, maybe she really does speak Spanish. And one little girl came up to me about 4 times and she said, ¿De veras habla español? And about after the 4th time, she asked me a question. I answered her. She's like, okay, I'll talk to you in Spanish then. I guess it's okay. So children have preferences. Sometimes parents tell their children that you are only supposed to speak English when you go to school. Sometimes kids have a preference because of their siblings. Sometimes they have a preference because English phonology is easier. And if you've got kids with some speech, especially artic issues, sometimes kids prefer English because the words are shorter and less polysyllabic from English to Spanish. Spanish is my second language, so I know more about that. We also want to think about what kinds of home language experiences and English language experiences children have had. Very often, home language experiences relate more to the social emotional end of things, and English experiences have to do more with the academics. So you might have kids that come in to preschool who can say all their colors in English but don't know them in Spanish, but their social skills are much higher in Spanish because they have had lots more practice around Spanish language interactions in social settings. And that's actually what the research says. Likewise, if we have children who are speaking home languages that are less common, they might not have had a lot of language experiences playing with peers in that home language. If they're Hmong speakers, for example, they might not live in a community with lots of Hmong speakers, so they haven't had time to play. So their English might be more useful to them for playing. These are things when we're interviewing families that are really critical for us to understand in order to contextualize our understanding of the children and families with whom we're serving. The individual child characteristics that we talked about previously also have to do with kids' abilities and interests and funds of knowledge. One of my students, I teach at Erickson, and one of my students had a little guy who was a Polish speaker, and he was absolutely not talking in school at all. And she was very concerned about whether he had speech and language issues or something else was going on. And so she did her action research project around home visits. She went on a home visit and walked into the living room of that little guy's house, and on the walls all over the living room were pictures of the family sailing in beautiful, gorgeous waters. And as soon as she started pointing to the pictures, he started having conversations and telling her about that bit of information. Oh, sorry. And so that opened up an avenue for her to bring pictures from his home into the classroom and make him an expert, and gave him the power to use his funds of knowledge to teach other children, and that broke the ice and helped him start speaking in English in class, because he was happened to be the only Polish speaker in that class. So it is critical for us to take the role of being an anthropologist, if you will. So thinking about thinking about ethnographic interviewing and how can you gather as much information about families. Not necessarily you bombard them at the beginning when they're signing up and you're trying to get them in the program, but how do you learn this information little by little as you are developing reciprocal relationships over the course of time. One important tool that you have to do this, and this is available on the ISBE website, is the home language survey. This is required in 3 to 5 and in K to 12 settings, but it is also a useful concept in birth to 3 to ask families if any other language than English is spoken at home, or so that children are hearing it or they're speaking it. Because young children, birth to 3, might not be talking very much, but we still would like to know what language they're listening in. I'm working with a self-contained special ed room right now where the kids are fairly nonverbal. They have a few, maybe 5 to 10 words expressively, but they understand Spanish much better or Chinese, for 2 of the kids, understand Spanish and Chinese much better than they understand English. So you want to make sure you're getting information about receptive language and expressive language, especially receptive for those for the little ones. And the last word on this, on getting to know your families, is understanding that we do collect some information about what languages the children speak. In birth to 3rd grade, birth to 3 context, the ages and stages is a very nice tool to help us understand how the parents are seeing their child's development, and language is a part of that. Many of you, if you're in a 3 to 5 program, are using a pre-IPT, which is we need an oral test to comply with ISBE regulations. It is not required in all child care or in Head Start classrooms, but understanding what children's English language skills are like are critical to being able to be educationally relevant. These all data should be triangulated so that you should use these pieces of information as well as collecting additional information from what parents say, what you see in children in classrooms, and to build an entire background about a clearer picture about who your young dual language learners are. So let's see, let's do a quick poll. What about the populations you guys are working with? What are the characteristics of your kiddos? Are they mostly simultaneous kids, mostly sequential, or are they a mix? Or don't you know? Let's see what we've got. And as you're doing that, there's, if you finish, you can, and you have some additional questions, you can type some questions in the, or comments in the chat box while we wait for the results of the poll. Overwhelmingly a mix of simultaneous and sequential. That is typical of what we are seeing now in Illinois. There is, 10 years ago, they were mostly sequential, and now we're seeing quite a big difference, which helps us, forces us to think about our instruction in a little bit of a different way, because we want to be able to maintain both languages and grow both languages in an additive way, but the trajectories look a little different, and what you need to do instructionally will be different based on whether you've got simultaneous or sequential kiddos. All right, so Ashley, do we have any questions?
We don't have any right now. So I would encourage people, if you, you should have a chat option, and you can either send questions directly to me if it's something real specific, or you should be able to send it to the entire group and that we can respond to. Other than, we did post the link as well for the site that you were trying to have a little trouble getting to a few slides ago, and that should be in your chat box as well. But please feel free to put some questions there. Nobody's sent anything in so far though.
Okay. Well, I will continue on then, but feel free to add questions as we go along, and we'll keep a running tally of those, okay? Thank you. So let's take a look at this statement. The early childhood program should be prepared to optimize the early experience of dual language learners by holding high expectations, capitalizing on strengths, including cultural and linguistic strengths, and providing them with the individualized developmental and learning supports necessary to succeed in school. Who is that statement true for? Do you think licensed child care folks, Head Start folks, school-based folks, or everybody? All of the above. You are such a smart group. You are totally right. Thank you, Ashley. This statement came out in June of 2016 from the federal departments of the Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Education for the very first time ever developing a joint policy statement that addressed dual language learners. We were back here in Illinois. I don't know if you were jumping up and down, but I was, that's for sure, because it was the first time that really explicitly the Health and Human Services and the Department of Education agreed and put it in writing that the early experiences of dual language learners are absolutely foundational to their eventual success in school, which is exactly what we're hearing lots of. And for those of you, some of you I saw on the list, some of you I know have been around for a while, maybe not quite as long as I have, but you've been around, and you know that early childhood, even preschool, never got a whole lot of attention back in the day, and certainly birth to 3, that's even more true for your services. And so the idea that we all, whether we're in licensed childcare, we're in Head Start programs, we're in school-based programs, we're in birth to 3 programs, 3 to 5, or school-age kindergarten programs, that all of us have this responsibility to optimize the language and culture of our children is an enormous, enormous political and philosophical shift for us. And we're all still trying to figure out what that looks like on the ground to some extent. You guys apparently are the front runners because you've signed up for this workshop already and know something about that. So what I want to do in this segment is talk a little bit about different language models that we can use in terms of serving young dual language learners that are based on research, that are effective practices, and that uphold that Health and Human Services and U.S. Department of Education joint policy statement. And so let's talk a little bit about the first one, which is English with home language support. Now, in the Illinois State Board of Education parlance, this is called a TPI program, or a transitional program of instruction, where English is the primary medium of instruction. There may be some home language support if you have a group of children that speak that language, but it isn't always the case where home languages support is provided by an adult in the classroom. In the ISBE context, again, 3 to 5 and K and up, this is the same. If there are 20 children at a site that share, less than 20 children at a site that share the same home language, they are required to implement this transitional program of instruction. In this context, there must be one teacher who has an ESL endorsement on their Pell licensure. They may have a teacher assistant that could be bilingual in one of the languages of their children, or they might have a teacher assistant in this context that only speaks English. The purpose for, or the use of language in this model is that English is the medium of instruction, but it is the medium of instruction using English as a second language techniques. So that does not mean, oh, they're all the same and I'm going to speak English to everybody, and that means everything is equal. It means that you will use differentiated language instruction and differentiated language objectives, that you will use a variety of different supports to help children learn that information, that you will muster and utilize the home language and engage families in supporting home language, even though you can't do that in school necessarily. You can engage the parents to do that. In the Head Start, I don't know how many Head Start people we have here, but in Head Start, they use this model a little bit differently, but typically again, that some children speak English as a home language and some share another home language is still the case. They don't have the specificity that ISBE does, that it has to be less than 20 children at a site. There's a little more leeway on that one. And again, in Head Start, ideally one teacher is fluent in English and one is fluent in the language of many of the other children, or sometimes both the teacher and the teacher assistants are fluent in both languages, or head teacher and the assistant teacher. I just want to underscore this in this last column, how important the home language support is to engaging families, so that this is a time, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but this is the time where if you're working on new vocabulary related to, let's say, fall, and we're talking about leaves falling and changing seasons and those kinds of things, that you would engage families to talk about that in Uzbek or in Japanese or in Mandarin, so that children are building up their background knowledge in order to be able to be more cognizant and more, that the input, it will be more comprehensible in English because they have some conceptual information in their home language. And so I don't see this happening as much as is possible. It happens a lot more in Canada than it happens here. And there are many, many heritage languages that are in Canada, and they do a better job at it. So I'm encouraging you to think about how to embed home language, even when English is the primary medium for your instruction in a TPI setting. This is a sample only of a language allocation plan that we worked on with one TPI program. This was a preschool program, and this teacher happened to be an ESL teacher, and they had an Urdu paraprofessional that was working with them. There were kids in the room that spoke Assyrian, Gujarati, Urdu, and Polish. But they did have a bilingual para for the Urdu kids. And so we took a look at how are we going to use the language over the course of the day. And the ESL teacher, obviously the lead teacher, is always going to use English and do ESL. But we took a look at how then to use that Urdu person to build, for example, in small group, to build some good conceptual knowledge in using oral Urdu, because it's hard to find books in Urdu, but developing a good oral language base was really important. We want to understand and underscore that at no point are we using concurrent translation. So in large group, the activities should be using good English as a second language techniques in English, and the Urdu speaker is not over there whispering anything in the ears of the Urdu speakers, because they will then not hear and listen to the English part and will be disruptive. And so English part should be in English, Urdu part should be in Urdu. We do not want adults code switching. They should stay in their language. Children may switch codes. They may translanguage, as the research talks about, where they'll use all their linguistic resources. Kids can do whatever they want. Grown-ups need to stay in their home language. So another version of the TPI model, you can just take that whole bilingual paraprofessional part off and have an English paraprofessional, so that all of that would happen in English. That would be another version of a TPI, a transitional program of instruction model. Now, if you are in a birth to 3 context or a home visiting context, again, you may be a person working with a bilingual paraprofessional, and when you're doing your home visiting lessons, if your parents is teacher's person, again, we do not want to see this concurrent translation happening. We want to see good, rich home language being used with the families, and then when English is the medium, then ESL is your, English as second language is your technique. For those who are in ISBE programs, there is a requirement that TBE programs, transitional bilingual education programs, must have these components. And they were written, as you can see, for school-age kids, because we don't really in early childhood compartmentalize them quite this way. But if you think about what we do, we certainly address all of them, just not in this very separate way. We integrate everything. So we talk about the core subjects must be offered in the student's home language, and instruction in language arts must happen in the student's home language. So this means that, you know, a little push-in 20-minute program can't possibly meet the needs of core subjects being offered in students' home language and language arts, right? Not going to happen. Instruction in English as a second language is required for all transitional bilingual education programs. And I hope you all know that we have, as a state, adopted the WIDA Early English Language Development Standards as our state standards. And if you want more information, again, there's a resource in the bibliography from WIDA, and you can go to wida.us and get the standards and a resource guide and videos and training. There's all kinds of things around that, and hopefully that will be coming to us soon in Illinois. But English as a second language as an explicit part of your transitional bilingual education program is required. And then this last one is always hard to talk about in the context of early childhood: instruction in the history and culture of the country, territory, or geographic regions, which is the native land of the students and their parents. Really, we're going to talk about this, Julie will talk about this in a minute, really addressing the culturally responsive part of what we do in early childhood programs, from birth talking about child rearing practices all the way up through kindergarten. And once they get into elementary school, this takes a little different version. In kindergarten, hopefully it looks the same. So there are different kinds of transitional bilingual education programs, and they look different in the elementary school than they look in the early childhood setting. So I'm going to talk about this one in terms of preschool. This, a TBE program, a transitional bilingual education program in early childhood, looks the same as a one-way dual program looks like. So the characteristics of a one-way dual is that there are 20 or more students who have limited English proficiency, again, based on the assessment that you did. And those students speak one language, the same language other than English, and they're at that attendance center. It doesn't have to be a school, but a center. So there's 20 or more kids in that building. You are required, if you are an ISBE, if you're governed by ISBE, you're required to have a transitional bilingual education program. And the teacher must be fluent in both languages, right, and licensed. So they must have a Pell and a bilingual licensure. And the models that can be used are ideally, best practice, a 90% of the day in home language and 10% in English, or 80% in home language and 20% in English. That 90-10, 80-20 is the best model for preschool, because we know this is an intense time of language development, and we need to support kids' language development in a big way, particularly if they're coming from homes in poverty. And in a one-way dual program, the model changes gradually from kindergarten to first to second to third grade. And very often, third grade is about 50% in each language, and it goes all the way up to sixth grade and stays that way. In a TB, a transitional bilingual education program, it might go a little faster, and children might exit at third grade, because in a TBE program, the goal is to get them in and out by third grade. In a one-way dual, the goal is to have kids be bilingual and biliterate, and they will continue up through sixth grade. But in early childhood, it looks the same, because we're at that early level at a 90-10 or an 80-20. And so if we do the right things and do best practices, then children will be ready to be successful at their next level. I mentioned already that all the standards are being addressed, the WIDA standards, but also for preschool, the Illinois Early Learning and Development Standards. And if you are working in birth to 3, you're using your standards as well. The WIDA only, the youngest age that WIDA addresses is 2.5 years old. So you have a little bit of 2.5 to 3 for the birth to 3 folks. Again, culture of the students, and typically the program begins in early childhood and continues through at least elementary school. So here's a language allocation plan that looks at what a full bilingual program might look like. Again, teacher speaks, I use Spanish in this case, Spanish, and the paraprofessional speaks Spanish. There's an identified ESL time, and the WIDA standards are differentiated. And this one happens to be an 80-20. You can also use a co-teaching model that we've seen this for some preschools, where there's an English teacher and a bilingual teacher who doesn't have early childhood certification, so they are doing a co-teaching model. So this one is an example of how you might do co-teaching, and divide groups up and make sure that children are getting the adequate amount of developmentally appropriate support in home language and in English. There's also something called a two-way dual program, and the two-way dual program, there's a few of them out there where 50% of the children speak English, 50% of the children speak another language, and the goal for a two-way dual is that children start in preschool and continue all the way through high school to earn their seal of biliteracy, so that they can take AP classes and AP tests in Spanish or Japanese or whatever language the two-way dual is in, and that both groups, the home language speakers of English and the home language speakers of the other language, are models for each other, and that this continues throughout their school career. The requirements obviously are that teachers and teacher assistants are fluent in both languages. There's a variety of different models. Some are 90-10, 80-20, as we mentioned before in the one-way. And some start out as a 50-50. So it's sort of it's a sort of across the board on two-way dual. Again, the purpose is bilingualism and biliteracy at very high levels, and continuity from preschool to kindergarten and up. Switching program models from preschool to kindergarten is pretty much the kiss of death, and guaranteed work for all of you special ed people out there. There's an example from District 112 of what their language allocation plan looks like for they have a two-way dual that goes from pre-K all the way through their elementary school. So you can see that they are using how many minutes. They have 70 minutes a week for English language arts, and 30 minutes per week for the social emotional curriculum that was happening in English. They had a lot of student choice in there and a very play-based orientation. So when you're selecting a model, You need to think about what are the child and family characteristics of your particular community. What do the families need to know about your program? What do you need to know about your families? What's the community trend data? I've been working in Logan Square in Chicago, and we know that that is a changing community. And so it's a very ripe community for a two-way dual program. So we're thinking about how can we look at what the demographics are telling us in terms of what kinds of programs would be appropriate. How many children are not being served in the configuration that you have at this moment? You need to look at the people. We know that there are not enough early childhood certified bilingual people in the state of Illinois. We have an acute workforce shortage of bilingual folks, and even more acute in early childhood. So it's helping us think about who do we have, how can we use them, what model can we use in order to optimize our human resources, and what is the research that supports the model. Again, in the bibliography, there's quite a lot of information around that. If you want more information on that, please type that in the chat box, or and let us know, or that can be something we can do some additional training on. So let's see what models you're currently implementing. I'm going to guess this is a pretty sophisticated bilingual group. Let's see if I'm right. "47% TBE. Ooh, okay. 33% with some home language support. Very good. 20% dual, one-way dual, and 27% two-way dual. Woohoo! Congratulations. I'm curious on the other. This could be a birth to three question, perhaps. I'm not sure. If you could chat in the top. Type in the chat box what the other would be. I would be interested in knowing that. So now we are on our third component, which is designing a culturally responsive environment. And Julie will take over.
So thank you. I get to do a lot of fun pictures. I'm going to try to look at this too with the lens of developmentally appropriate, because many of the strategies of developmentally appropriate practice also are strategies that are research-based for supporting our dual language learners. So you've learned about your students and your families, you've thought about models, we know about school codes, so now we have to use the proven strategies that help our students develop. You've still got the thing, Pat. There we go. Okay. So culturally responsiveness is really one of the key instructional strategies that we'll talk about for the remaining part of this webinar. We see the intersection of developmentally appropriate practice and that best practice with our dual language learners in that word responsive. A guiding principle of developmentally appropriate practice is meeting children where they are. So this begins with a commitment of knowing your students well, academically, socially, emotionally. We have to put in that time to gather authentic evidence about where our students are. And then we can plan those challenging and achievable goals. Part of being responsive then is asking questions, talking to the parents, talking to community members of other cultures, get to know other cultures through your own reading, through your colleagues, through watching movies, listening to music. I want to reemphasize here that one thing Pat sent, home visits are probably one of the best instructional practices we have for meeting children where they are. And so we really encourage, especially if you're in a preschool for all, getting those home visits in, because that creates opportunities for planning on building your students' life experiences and bringing that into the classroom environment. Cultural responsiveness is also a requirement for preschool for all. The early childhood environmental rating scale is the tool that's used by the state to evaluate classroom environments and instruction. And you can see here that some of the requirements that there's different types of dramatic play props. There's got to be at least 10 positive examples of diversity within types of books, types of things that are displayed with pictures and photos and the play materials. And not just about language, but the classroom materials has to include diversity in race and culture, age, ability, and non-traditional gender roles. So here are the foundational practices. The first one is use of home language. This we've talked a lot about. We need to bring the home language. And my own personal story about that, and you would think I might know this, when my granddaughter went into a dual language program, I asked all my colleagues that are experts, what can I do to support her learning of Spanish? And they said, strengthen her home language of English. So I know that, but we always want to help them learn their new language, but it's important to strengthen their knowledge of their home language. The second one is representation of cultural funds of knowledge. This is that positive viewpoint that the knowledge children have already, that they've learned in their home and their cultural communities, is valuable and legitimate. And this counters that deficit view of children don't know much, they don't have much background experience, just because they don't know the dominant group's knowledge base. We need to know what they are. It's background knowledge at its most expansive view, taking in every child's background knowledge. So the third one is a culturally responsive environment will have indicators of family values. How can we represent what's important for your particular groups of children in the classroom? And fourth, validating their identity. Do we have materials and pictures and props and learning activities that evaluate how they identify themselves in their race or their culture, gender, or ability? We did include a reference at the end of this webinar to Cummins' identity work. We know that when children's knowledge of themselves and what they have learned in their home and their cultural community is recognized, valued, legitimized, they feel valued and they invest themselves more in their learning. That research on identity also shows if children experience damaging representations of who they are or who their community members are, they may distance themselves as a self-preservation mechanism and disengage from learning environments. So on the following slides, I get to show you pictures. These are some examples that were collected during the Awards of Excellence for Linguistically and Culturally Diverse Best Practices for the Accelerate system. As you look at these slides, think about which of these foundational practices are represented. You can pick more than one. So take a look at this, and Ashley, I think you've got a poll for this, or maybe not.
I don't think so.
Okay, so when you look at this for yourself and for your own learning and being a good developmentally appropriate student, you can say it out loud to yourself. Self-talk is good. When I look at this picture, I see a lot of validating sense of identity. You can see that there are pictures of different color faces for children to look at. The poster on the far left, you can kind of see that it's a little girl using a walker. That little boy is giving a bath to a baby doll. And you see pictures of families, and that starts to show a lot more representation of what their families are like. Let's look at the next picture. What you see here was of some type of cultural dinner, I believe. And for yourself, think about what this represents. One of the first things I see with this is that there's a lot of use of the cultural funds of knowledge. Children know what types of food are made in the home and the types of equipment making food. I'm sure there was use of home language here because there's describing the foods in their native language, and a lot of family values. Providing food and comfort is a family value for many cultures. How about this one? The teacher has weekly targeted vocabulary, and the parents often then fill in pictures along with the English word and their home language word. And when they have, you can see at the top, it says happy. They have the different words in a variety of languages. So that value, that really does validate their children's sense of identity when they see their language. It's the use of the home language. And the next one, the next picture, Pat. This was, they had the classroom had read some fiction and nonfiction books about fairy tales, folk tales in Indian languages, and they had also had a volunteer come in and help learn about the Hindi alphabet. They brought in traditional everyday clothes, and they were discussed and added to the dramatic play area, and these children were helping to make hummus. So the instructional strategies, we can see cultural funds of knowledge and validating that sense of identity and using the home language since it was Hindi. One of the ways that teachers can connect with families and encourage use of home language are home activities. This one that they were tracing the children's hand and writing down their favorite things in each finger, but you can see it underlined there. Please put this in your home language. And when they brought that to school then, the children were encouraged to talk about describing their favorite things in their first language. It's a little bit hard to see this picture, but it was a student-led project about growing things. They with their families chose which kind of plant they would like to grow, and they talked about the seeds and then the type of plant that grew. This is, when it comes from what the children know, it is much more meaningful, and the parents can describe in their home language what the process and what the names and the labels of those different seeds and plants are. This was a study, they had several children from China in this classroom who spoke Chinese, and they had done a study where they talked about all the different ways you can do Chinese symbol writing, and the children learned what their name looked like in the letters of the Chinese language. So here we saw a lot about the use of home language. The children who spoke Chinese had a lot more understanding of those kinds of letters and symbols, so their identity was also strengthened. This was an activity that I've seen done in many different classrooms. They take those little cardboard blocks you can see at the bottom, cover them with paper, and you can send them home as a family project. And they put the children's picture on them and then added their names. Sometimes they have families decorate it with family pictures, and it becomes a place of building a classroom community because they can talk about each other, and they're always very interested in that authentic environmental print of each other's names. This was another family activity where the families were to draw pictures. The adults with their children were drawing pictures of the people in their family and labeling them. You can see there's all different ways of doing this, but that type of activity we see children return to time and time again. When you post this in a classroom and add a pointer, the children will quiz each other on who all the people in their family are. They start to learn the names of their classmates, but then they also start to learn the siblings and the tias and the abuelos, and they learn how to label all of those and have a great time. It's also, when we think about the developmentally appropriate practice of finding a calming corner or a safe space to relax, sometimes having family pictures there gives the children a place to go to calm, and children who are learning two languages, a place to decelerate all of their hard thinking. I really liked this one too, because every parent has dreams for their children, and it validates families knowing that we want to know what they hope for their children. We want to know their learning goals for their child. And so when you post this with pictures in a place where parents can see them, it really makes them feel included in the reciprocal relationships in the classroom. And I want to end this last little section with an emphasis on culturally responsive thematic units. We have to follow the children's lead and look at what is their cultural fund of knowledge if they are going to be able to play different things. These particular kids had experience with, and I won't say it as good as Pat, of course, but a la tienda de frozen paletas. So they had this popsicle cart, and they built it. They built everything in the classroom, and these smart little preschoolers decided they wanted to go to other classrooms to sell. So they embedded what the children knew about something familiar to them. The children created it, and then they could use their listening and speaking standards and their math skills to use selling their popsicles. Another one I saw in a preschool classroom was, again, following their lead. When it's springtime and you're planning out themes, to be culturally responsive, you need to know what the children's background knowledge is. So in probing with the families and with the children, many of the kids had experiences with gardens or landscaping or garden shops. So they built their theme around gardens and landscaping. They could then work on all their standards within this type of play where they could grow, sell flowers. In the block area, and this was a kindergarten, the children were really engaging in really some complex engineering and planning, and then the teacher was embedding the language. Children knew a lot about farming and a lot about a ranch, and so they were then building the ranch because they had some background knowledge, but then adding in the literacy component. And lastly, one teacher decided she wanted to do, this was at kindergarten, wanted to do a restaurant theme, and this has kind of come from the kids. And she, in her mind, thought the best way to do that was make a sit-down restaurant where the children came in and looked at a menu and ordered. But when she talked to the children, they did not have background experience of eating in restaurants like that. They had experience with McDonald's. So again, they had to use their planning and construction skills to make out a McDonald's, and they decided they needed the drive-through. They didn't even have its place. They mostly went through the drive-through. So again, you see the use of language, the multiple languages, based on what they have background knowledge in. So any questions or comments on this particular segment of culturally responsive environments?
Nothing's coming into the chat box, Julie.
Pardon?
I said there's nothing in the chat box right now.
Okay, then we'll go on, Pat.
This is a very quiet group today, so feel free to continue to write some comments if you think of anything as we move along. But now we're going to, in our very rapid review here of the big five, the last one has to do with strategies instructional strategies that support student growth. And we're going to look at some video clips to do that. We need to think about comprehensible input as the critical factor in making sure we are communicating with children, because we know how important that student-child interaction is, whether it's with a parent educator, a therapist, a speech therapist, an OT, a kindergarten teacher, a bilingual paraprofessional. That comprehensible input, making sure that what's going in is understood and that there is a quality of interactions a la class between adults and children, is absolutely the most important piece of developing early biliteracy and bilingualism, and a necessary foundation. So I don't know if we have any Arabic speakers in the room, but let's see if this works. It worked once and before, so we'll see if it's going to work. We're going to have you learn a little bit of Arabic. So if you're an Arabic speaker, woohoo, you have an extra added resource for you today. And what I want you to do is to think about how this makes you feel and how you're learning.
5,000 years of Chinese music and dance in one night. A spectacle.
راح العصاية والدين المفروجة والثلاث مسننة والأربعة بترقص والخمسة زي الكعبة والستة زعلانة والسبعة بتشكر الله والثمانية بتصلي والتسعة بتضرب سلام والعشرة بتشوف الكل. واحد اثنين ثلاثة أربعة خمسة ستة سبعة ثمانية تسعة 10. نجمة واحد.
So everybody ready to speak Arabic now? So on this one, we're going to talk about the dimensions of comprehensible input. And they're on your screen here. So let's just do a quick poll to see which of these strategies helped you make sense of that Arabic activity. Was there enough repetition for you to be able to remember all those new words? Did the visuals help you understand what was going on, what the context was? Were the actions of the little characters, did those help you? How about, was it too fast or too slow? Did the rate of speech impact you? How about your prior knowledge? What was it about? What were you learning about in that little video? Your cultural background. Do you know anything about soccer? Your language level in Arabic, your developmental level of your home language and any other language, and the wait time. How was the time between each of the introduction of each of the new items? Which of those things helped you make sense of that little video clip? All right. Oh, you guys are big visual people. Yes, the visuals are enormous. And so if we think about this as what we need to do, whether we're in a home visiting context, whether we're in a toddler classroom, whether we are doing a parent group, whether we are working in a preschool or a kindergarten setting, think about how much having all of those things helped you at least get a clue. Hopefully you knew that you were learning some numbers in Arabic, and that that you didn't have enough repetition, but you had an idea that we were counting because you had some background knowledge on that. The prior knowledge, I guess. The prior knowledge, I hope all of you knew you were counting, and that your language level, because your language level was so new, was so low, that your language level didn't help you very much. But if you're thinking about whenever you're working with second language learners in their second language, you got to have all of these in mind and be cognizant of how to plan for them in terms of making the input comprehensible. Thank you, Ashley. And so that was a very quick comprehensible input conversation. And I just wanted to, the third piece is higher level thinking. And this is something that we want to be very, very intentional about as well, because sometimes with our kids who are just learning English, particularly if we're in an English only kind of a setting, a TPI setting, we have a tendency to have them do things that are far below their developmental level, or we think kids are have less cognitive capacity because of their English learning. levels. And so we want to make sure that we're providing children lots of opportunities of higher level thinking where the language is balanced, but we're also working on all of those language skills and all of those other learning skills that are critical at your age level. So we're going to take a little look at a video here, a short video. And what I want you to do is to think about what evidence you see that's related to each of these instructional practices. How is this teacher making the input comprehensible? How is higher level thinking being addressed? And what do you see in terms of culturally responsive practice? And I want you to type that into the chat box. So this, again, this is on your resource bibliography or on your references. This comes from Linda Espinosa's work, and she's developed some videotapes that might be useful to you if you want to do some more training at your site. Or we're going to look at a little small group making butter.
Put her finger right here. What's that?
Come on. Shake, shake, shake it on, or else it won't be a butter. Shake, 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 shake. We're not gonna be getting that little bit. And not gonna
Shake in Tagalog?
hello.
That's how you say shake?
Hello. Yes, hello.
Hello,
Shake, shake.
Shake, shake, shake. Hello, hello? We'll find out whether we like it, okay? Wow, what'd you do? Did it change? What happened? What happened? You know what? Let's go ahead. We're going to pour the extra. See, look at all that liquid. Do you see all that? We don't want that part. We have to pour that out.
What's liquid?
What's liquid? That's liquid is kind of, you know how water is liquid?
Oh, the yellow stuff?
The extra, see the runny part?
Yeah, that's this part?
That's what liquid is. It's kind of like water.
The yellow part? This yellow part?
That's the extra part.
Can
We
I
want to just
try
keep the butter, okay?
I can take out the liquid.
Do you want to help him to get
And
some?
Could you help me take out the liquid?
Let's pour the liquid out, yes.
Could you help me? I
Well,
got my
you know what?
hat.
You can try it yourself. Do you want to do that?
Yeah.
There you go. Did you see how I did that? Oh, there it goes. Here, that's okay. Go ahead.
There's more liquid.
We'll do it together.
That's so juicy.
Is it running out? Do you remember how you made that butter?
Yeah.
What'd you have to do?
First put milk on my jar and then put a little bit of salt and then put a little bit of that
Oh,
and then shake it and then it will turn into butter.
it was really hard work, wasn't it?
All right, type into your chat box, if you will. What strategies did you see happening in terms of comprehensible input? What evidence of higher level thinking? And how was this culturally responsive? And Ashley, I hope you can display the chat box, right?
Well, everybody should be able to just tap to everyone or type to everyone, and then you'd be able to see it. So if people have got ideas, feel free to just type in the box and just make sure it's set for the two to go to everyone.
I can't see it though.
Oh, well, and no one's typing in right now, so I'm not sure if people don't have ideas or.
Oh, there.
So.
Okay.
Can you see now?
I can't see the chat box, no.
No, if you call chat. Okay, so we've got someone.
There's nothing in there?
What?
There isn't anything in the chat boxes?
A couple people have responded now. So people are saying they've got actions and gestures, repetition, discussing how to say shake in other languages, talking about what words mean, culturally responsive, so words in different languages, higher level thinking. Students use new vocabulary when speaking and had the opportunity to explain how they made more butter. So they used TPR. She was asking questions and repeating words and definitions. Little girl started to use a new word again and again, and soon she learned it. So that's comprehensible input.
Beautiful. You're geniuses. That's fabulous. All right. We are running out of time, so we're going to skip over. Oops. I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Right. So we know that when you learn something, if you don't do it or change some of your dispositions toward the topic, it's not going to be beneficial for student outcomes. So think about what your next step is. Are you going to focus on identifying your dual language learners, getting to know your families more, deciding on models, making your environment more culturally responsive, strategies that support student growth? If you could please type what you believe your next step is so your friends can see it and maybe it spurs some ideas onto them. So please type something in the chat box of what you see your next step.
And while you're doing that, see, we're very good at multitasking because we are running out of time. So another thing that you can type into your chat box after you get done with that next step is thinking about future trainings from the Birth to Third Continuity, the B3 Continuity Project. Do you like the webinars? Would you like some in-person seminars? We're talking about doing some play-based instruction, some work around play-based. After the Kids Summit, there seemed to be an awful lot of interest in that, and vertical articulation and alignment with pre-K to third. Julie and I are doing some work, particularly pre-KK first grade right now. That is really pretty exciting and pretty amazing work. It was some innovative stuff, innovative folks. And then go ahead, Julie.
One of the requests early on from our Birth to Third grade projects was really with administrators. What do you look for if you're going into a developmentally appropriate classroom? Let's say add morning meeting or literacy center or choice playtime. What does the administrator look for, and how does that align with the components of the Danielson framework? So we're looking to have either an in-person or a webinar about that topic too. So please go ahead and type in any topics that you think would be additional ideas, or if you like one of these ideas in particular, if you think a webinar or an in-person seminar might be more useful.
We want to be very responsive to your needs and to support you in your journey. And so the more you tell us, the more likely it is to happen. So this is the time to be outspoken. And finally, there are some resources on your bibliography that you may be familiar with, but if you're not, these are very basic instructional resources. Many Language Building Connections is for birth to 3 providers. Many Languages One Classroom really is addressing more 3 to 5 age classrooms or kiddos, and then the basics of supporting dual language learners has some of the work that we talked about today, looking at from the perspective of if you're a bilingual person or if you're a monolingual English person, what things you can do. So it amplifies some of the concepts that we've talked about today. Here's your bibliography for those of you who like to read more about. And the digital resources on the Illinois Early Learning Project, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We now have some videos in Spanish and in English that apply the WIDA standards to some of the little video clips that we've got in there. That's very excited about that. I mentioned the National Center on Cultural and Linguistic Responsiveness that has that gathering family background that Ashley put in the chat box. That Making Butter comes from teaching at the beginning videos. It has 20 amazing videos that do a whole lot of different things. And then WIDA, the WIDA World-Class Instructional Design and Assessment standards, the early years, which are only came out in 2014, which are relatively new, and they are available in Spanish and English, are other resources that could be useful to you. So we want to leave you with this last thought that, and thank you so very much for tuning in. And we love all of the work that you're doing out there and are so happy to know that you are out there making the world a more beautiful place. Thank you so much. And if you need CPDUs, here's Ashley's information. Any last thoughts, Ashley or Julie?
No, I just thank everyone for their time. This is a hard time in the middle of late afternoon, so thank you for participating.
Yeah, no, there's all kinds of, I appreciate the comments at the end here, which has given us some good ideas. I am trying to upload the PDF of this presentation. It's just not wanting to cooperate. It's going really slow. But the materials and a recording will be posted to the B3 Continuity website. So we'll send out an email and you can watch for, if you want to share the recording or you want to have access to, send the PDF or something like that, please watch for that. Thanks.